The jungle was quiet in the first light of dawn, the kind of silence that settles only after a night of violence. Along the riverbank, a young marine paused beside the still bodies of the enemy. Their uniforms hung loosely from narrow shoulders. Their faces, gaunt and hollow, looked more like exhausted boys than hardened soldiers. In that moment, he realized something he had not been trained to expect. The men he was fighting were far smaller, far weaker than any briefing had ever suggested. This was the Pacific War as it existed beyond the maps and arrows. A place where bodies told the truth long before reports did. Where American Marines carried rifles, gear, and the weight of a new kind of warfare, while Japanese soldiers struggled under burdens their failing supply lines could no longer support. The question that haunted many who fought there was simple but deeply human. How could these men, already worn down by hunger and disease, continue to fight with such relentless determination? And what does their suffering reveal about the real forces that decide life and death in World War II? To understand the answer, we must return to the beginning, to the island where these truths first began to surface. When the Pacific War shifted into its first true American offensive, the world was watching a contest of empires. But for the men who landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, it was not geopolitics that filled their thoughts. It was the weight of their packs, the heat rising off the sand, and the uncertainty of what waited beyond the tree line. For many American Marines, this marked their first encounter with the brutal, intimate reality of ground combat in World War II. They came ashore armed with confidence, training, and the expectation of meeting a well-equipped enemy building an airfield that threatened the lifeline to Australia. The Japanese soldiers on the island had been working under a different set of pressures. Their orders were clear: secure the airfield, hold the island, and prevent the Americans from gaining a foothold. Yet their position depended on fragile supply lines already stretched thin across vast ocean distances. What looked like a straightforward confrontation on a map was, in reality, a looming test of military logistics that neither side fully understood at the time. American reconnaissance suggested formidable defenses, but the initial landing met almost no resistance. The Japanese soldiers had withdrawn inland, leaving equipment, tools, and half-finished positions behind. The Marines quickly realized the strategic importance of the airstrip, renaming it Henderson Field after a fallen aviator. For the first time in the Pacific War, the initiative had shifted. But the quiet of those first hours would not last. After nightfall, the jungle changed. Whispers carried through the humid air. Patrols spotted shadows moving just beyond the perimeter. The Japanese soldiers were preparing their counterattack with a determination that belied their physical condition. Many had already endured weeks of limited rations. Their bodies were shrinking before the Americans even arrived, the early signs of a struggle that would define much of the fighting in the Pacific War. The Battle of the Tenaru River on August 21st revealed the truth with brutal clarity. Colonel Ichiki's assault came in disciplined waves, a fearless charge across a sandbar directly into Marine machine gun fire. At a distance, the attackers appeared as any determined fighting force would. But when dawn broke and the smoke drifted away, the American Marines saw the reality up close. The Japanese soldiers, lying along the shoreline, were smaller than expected, their limbs thin, their equipment scaled for bodies that had been underfed long before the battle began. For the Marines, this realization was unsettling. They had trained to face an enemy of equal strength, not men whose war had already begun to drain them physically. The battlefield itself had exposed what reports had not. The war between two nations would also become a war between two logistical systems, one capable of sustaining its fighters, the other straining to keep them alive. Guadalcanal was only the first chapter. But within its opening days, the contrast in physical condition between American Marines and Japanese soldiers began shaping every engagement that followed. And as supplies dwindled further, the struggle for the island would become a grim preview of the hardships waiting on future battlefields across the Pacific. The battles that followed Guadalcanal unfolded like a grim progression across the islands of the Pacific War, each campaign revealing new layers of the struggle between endurance and exhaustion. For the American Marines, every landing brought fresh hardship. For the Japanese soldiers defending those islands, each new battle marked another step deeper into a logistical abyss that would shape their fate long before bullets did. Tarawa, in November 1943, was the first time many Marines faced defenders who were not yet weakened by hunger. The Japanese soldiers there were well supplied, well dug in, and determined to hold their ground to the last man. Their bunkers were carved from coral. Their machine gun nests were engineered with lethal precision. In those 76 hours of blood and fire, the American Marines discovered a sobering truth. When Japanese soldiers had food, water, and ammunition, they were among the most formidable opponents in World War II. Tarawa proved that the difference in physical size was not a measure of fighting spirit. It was a measure of supply lines. But Tarawa was the exception. As the Pacific War moved westward, the advantages of American military logistics grew sharper, while Japanese supply routes grew thinner and more desperate. By the time the Marines assaulted Peleliu in September 1944, the contrast was unmistakable. Colonel Nakagawa's garrison fought from a network of caves and ridges that turned the island into a natural fortress. Yet inside those caves, the Japanese soldiers were dwindling in both number and physical strength. The heat was suffocating. Water was scarce. Rations were cut to fractions of what a fighting man required. American Marines, advancing through Bloody Nose Ridge, sometimes found bodies so light that two men could carry what should have taken four. Bones pressed sharply against the skin. Rifles lay beside hands too thin to hold them securely. Eugene Sledge wrote of these scenes with a clarity that still unsettles readers decades later. He understood that the enemy was not collapsing because they lacked resolve. They were collapsing because their bodies had been starved by the very system meant to sustain them. The Japanese soldiers fought on, not because they were physically capable, but because duty demanded it and surrender was unthinkable. At Iwo Jima, the war took yet another form. The Japanese defenders had spent months carving an underground world suited to their smaller frames. Tunnels averaged heights that fit Japanese soldiers comfortably, but forced many American Marines to crouch or crawl. In these spaces, the size advantage that helped Marines in open combat became a liability. The Americans adapted quickly, sealing entrances, using flamethrowers, and collapsing tunnels to avoid close quarters fighting where mobility shifted to the defenders. This period of the Pacific War showed the full spectrum of human endurance. In some battles, the Japanese soldiers fought with the strength of well-fed men defending fortress-like positions. In others, they fought with bodies worn thin by malnutrition and disease. The American Marines saw both faces of the enemy and understood that each revealed something deeper about the war. Victory was shaped not only by courage or firepower, but by the unseen machinery of logistics that kept one army alive while another slowly faded away. As the Pacific War pushed deeper toward Japan's defensive perimeter, the battlefield shifted from clashes of maneuver to grim tests of human survival. What had begun as a contest of armies became by late 1940 and 1945 a contest between bodies pushed past their breaking point and the unforgiving logic of military logistics. Nowhere was this more evident than on the islands where Japanese soldiers fought long after their strength had begun to fail. The downward spiral often began quietly. A reduced ration here, a water shortage there. But over weeks, those shortages accumulated into a slow physical unmaking. Japanese soldiers, who had once weighed more than 120 pounds, dwindled to 100, then 90, then less. Their muscles weakened. Their joints swelled. Some developed beriberi, a vitamin deficiency that stole the ability to walk. Others suffered relentless illnesses brought on by immune systems too depleted to defend them. These were not isolated cases. Across the Pacific War, entire units were shrinking in both size and capability. On Cape Gloucester, American Marines escorting prisoners noticed how fragile their captives had become. Men who had once trained rigorously now struggled to put one foot in front of the other. Skin lesions marked their arms and legs. Eyes stared forward with the vacant exhaustion of soldiers who had stood watch too long without fuel to sustain them. Disease, malnutrition, and fatigue had taken more from them than any rifle ever could. Malnutrition reshaped the course of the fighting itself. Japanese soldiers could still fire rifles from prepared positions, but they could no longer move heavy machine guns, relocate mortars, or transport ammunition across muddy terrain. They could not evacuate their wounded. They could not counterattack with force. Even in close combat, where Japanese doctrine leaned on aggression and bayonet skill, their diminished strength meant that larger, well-fed American Marines often overpowered them in seconds. The tragedy was not in their courage, but in their physical inability to match what their training demanded. Okinawa was the final and most terrible expression of these realities. By the spring of 1945, the Japanese 32nd Army was a force holding an impossible line. Many of its soldiers were already underfed before the battle began. Once American forces sealed the island, resupply became nearly non-existent. Soldiers weighing 90 pounds were expected to carry rifles, dig fortifications, and withstand bombardments that lasted hours. They remained in their caves until their bodies simply stopped answering the demands placed upon them. For some Japanese soldiers, escape became physically impossible. They could not run from collapsing lines. They could not swim coastal waters to safety. Even if they had wanted to surrender, many lacked the strength to move toward American positions. Their war ended not with dramatic last stands, but with quiet, unseen deaths, bodies giving out in the darkness of tunnels carved into the earth. By the time the fighting stopped, it was clear that military logistics had delivered a verdict as decisive as any battlefield maneuver. The Americans could feed, supply, and evacuate their troops. The Japanese could not. The contrast reshaped the final chapters of World War II and left a legacy carved into the very bodies of the men who fought it. For the American Marines who fought through the island chains, the war was not remembered as a triumph of strength over weakness, but as a lesson in what sustains an army through the darkest months of a campaign. They saw firsthand that courage existed on both sides. What differed, what truly shaped the Pacific War, was the structure behind the men. The food they ate, the medicine they received, and the logistical networks that kept them alive. The Marines learned, day by day, that a modern military is only as strong as the supply lines running behind it. From the American standpoint, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Wherever Marines advanced, they found Japanese soldiers whose bodies told the story of a nation struggling to fight a global conflict without the industrial depth required to support it. The Americans had hospital ships offshore, medical corpsmen positioned close behind the lines, and a supply system capable of delivering food, ammunition, and water across thousands of miles. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, relied on shipping lanes, increasingly cut off by submarines, aircraft, and naval blockades. The result was an enemy whose bravery remained intact even as his body began to fail. Strategically, these realities reshaped the larger course of World War II. American planners came to understand that certain Japanese garrisons did not need to be defeated in direct battle. They only needed to be isolated. The island-hopping strategy, bypassing strong points, severing their supply lines, and letting military logistics do the rest, was not simply a tactical choice, but a recognition that starvation and disease were already eroding Japanese combat power. It was a harsh calculation, but one that saved thousands of American lives and shortened the war. Globally, the lessons were profound. Military leaders studying the Pacific War concluded that no amount of discipline or martial spirit could substitute for the fundamentals required to sustain an army. Nations watching the conflict unfold understood that modern warfare would be won not only by soldiers on the front lines, but by factories, transport ships, and infrastructure networks far from the battlefields. The story of the Japanese soldiers, fighting valiantly even as their bodies weakened, became a somber reminder of what happens when a nation outruns at its ability to sustain its own forces. In the end, the Pacific War did not merely highlight American firepower. It revealed a deeper truth about human endurance, national capacity, and the unforgiving arithmetic of logistics that underlies every modern conflict. When the guns finally fell silent across the Pacific, the echoes of the war lingered longest, not in the shattered fortifications or the scarred landscapes, but in the memories of the men who walked away from them. American Marines carried home the images of opponents who had fought with a heartbreaking mixture of resolve and exhaustion. Japanese soldiers, many reduced to little more than bone and willpower, had stood their ground long after their bodies should have failed them. The Pacific War left no illusions about what human beings can endure or how deeply they can suffer when the machinery of war pushes them beyond their limits. The legacy of those battles extends far beyond the islands themselves. World War II demonstrated that strategy does not begin on the front lines. It begins in cargo holds, rail yards, shipyards, and supply depots. Military logistics proved as decisive as firepower. The ability of the United States to feed, equip, and evacuate its forces shaped the very rhythm of the conflict. The inability of Japan to sustain its soldiers, meanwhile, carved tragedy into the experience of every man who fought under a rising sun that could no longer provide for him. Yet, even amid these harsh realities, there remains a deeper and more human truth. The courage of the Japanese soldiers was real, even as starvation hollowed them out. The steady determination of the American Marines was real, even as they faced an enemy who refused to surrender. Their stories, intertwined through suffering and endurance, remind us that wars are fought by individuals whose bodies carry the weight of decisions made far from the battlefield. The lessons of the Pacific War still resonate today. They warn modern nations that no fighting force can survive without secure supply lines. They remind commanders that logistics is not a supporting role, but a pillar of combat power. And they ask us to remember the cost paid by those whose strength ran out long before their will did. As we reflect on these histories, we invite you to share your perspective. What do you believe is the most enduring lesson from the struggle between American Marines and Japanese soldiers in the Pacific War? Your insights matter because history is not just recorded, it is interpreted, questioned, and carried forward by those who choose to remember. If you value examinations of World War II that look beyond the surface and explore the human realities that shaped its outcome, consider joining us for future discussions. The battlefields may be silent now, but their lessons still speak to us.